Excellencies, Mr. Ambassador of the Hellenic Republic and Mr. Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus, Madam Chair of the Supervisory Board of the University, Mr. Dean of the Faculty of the Humanities, Mr. Executive Director of the Ekaterini Laskaridis Foundation, representatives and guests of the Foundation, members of the Curatorium Panel of the Marilena Laskaridis Chair, Board of the Dutch Society for Modern Greek Studies, dear colleagues, dear students, dear family and friends. Crisis, what else? The phrase that figures in this Athenian graffiti by the Greek public artist blips.gr highlights crisis as an all-encompassing framework and mode of living, the new normal. The phrase evokes the well-known Nespresso commercial in which George Clooney charms consumers into seeing that there is no other choice for coffee than espresso. Nespresso, what else? Similarly, the graffiti's phrase casts crisis as a lack of choice, a self-evident, inevitable condition. Today, crisis pops up everywhere in public rhetoric. The environmental crisis, the global financial crisis, the European debt crisis, the refugee crisis, are all phenomena brought under the rubric of this term. In Greece, since the debt crisis broke out in 2009, the association of the country with crisis is inescapable. A crisis that in the course of 9 years has radically changed people's lives and their outlook on the future, and that still persists despite signs of financial recovery. As debates about Greece's years of crisis and its path to recovery have been rekindled with the official end of the bailout program for Greece last month, the question of how to imagine a future beyond crisis becomes now more urgent than ever. This question will also guide my talk today. The phrase crisis, what else, captures a current understanding of crisis as a chronic state that limits the space of choice. If crisis, what else, is a rhetorical question, suggesting that there is nothing else beyond crisis, how do we turn it into a real question? How do we think this else? Alternative narratives, modes of expression, futures, beyond the framework of crisis that shapes the present. The term crisis is a good place to start thinking this else. In my work, I have learned that self-evidently used terms like crisis call for the most critical scrutiny. This is why I have devoted many years of my research to another self-evidently used popular term, the barbarian. Just as the barbarian, the term crisis has a long history with, as you may have guessed, Greek beginnings. The word's meanings in ancient Greek show that choice is actually a defining element of crisis. The verb krino, from which crisis derives, meant to separate, choose, judge, or decide. For Greeks, as historian Reinhard Koselleck writes, the word krisis meant decision in the sense of reaching a crucial point that would tip the scales in politics, or in the sense of verdict, judgment, or what we now call critique. Thus, if crisis today often works to restrict choice, this understanding of crisis lacks one of its key ingredients: choice between alternatives. Turning crisis from a judgment of failure or a monologic narrative into a democratic space of choice commits us to a critique of the present, another cognitive crisis. This means, first of all, refusing to take crisis as a descriptive term and exploring it as a framing that favors certain visions of the past, present, and future while precluding others. Which attitudes to the past and the future has the crisis engendered in Greece? What alternative grammars or modes of expression have emerged through the Greek crisisscape? Both questions are at the heart of my research. They are also central to the research group I have initiated in the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis, with the title Crisis, Critique and Futurity, which I coordinate with my colleague Eva Fotiadou. With young scholars from different disciplines, we explore how in Greece and elsewhere in the world, art, literature, social and cultural initiatives turn frameworks of crisis into occasions for rethinking the past and imagining the present and the future otherwise. At stake in these questions is what in the title of my talk I call Futurity. Futurity refers to ways of thinking the future that involve both the future and the past. There are many versions of futurity, since the future today is the object of conflicting strategies and claims. The language of finance, for example, is full of future speak. Speculations, market-based projections, forecasting, risk management are all concepts invested in designing and projecting a future based on what Arjuna Padurai calls a politics of probability. My understanding of futurity follows what Padurai calls a politics of possibility, that conceives the future as open to modes of being and thinking that we cannot calculate or determine in the present. The past can activate such possibilities when turning to the past is not just retrospective, based on nostalgic idealizations, but prospective, concerned, according to Svetlana Boym, with the past's many potentialities that have not been realized. By revisiting past objects to find tools and grammars for articulating different possible futures, we turn past archives, in Hal Foster's words, from excavation sites into construction sites. In other words, the remembrance of things past, to use the English title of Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, turns into the futurity of things past. The search for the futurity of things past is important in times of crisis, when future prospects feel limited and people look for guidance in the past. The role of the past in shaping the present is especially pronounced in the case of Greece, as the modern nation's identity has been largely defined by its history. The past, Dimitris Giogas notes, has been perceived by modern Greeks as both an asset and a burden. The classical past, particularly, has been a source of self-determination and national pride, but has also worked, especially in the European imagination, as a reminder of the contrast between the classical ideal and modern Greek reality. Echoing descriptions of Greece by 19th century European travelers and Romantic authors, the European press in the crisis years found in the material ruins of the classical heritage a host of visual metaphors for the present state of Greece. In the crisis years, the popular motif of the burden of the past resurfaced in artistic reflections about the future. In this graffiti by Dimitris Taxis, both past and future become a burden. A boy is trapped in the present between books with titles referring to the past, Plato, Socrates, democracy, modern Greek history, and books with titles that capture the contradictions of the present and the lack of future. Athens means luxury, survival guide, no future. In this image of entrapment between a past the young generations cannot live up to and a future closing down on them, the present seems to leave no space for futurity and hope. Against the backdrop of the crisis, however, artistic preoccupations with the future have intensified in Greece. The recent exhibitions Tomorrows, Urban Fictions for Possible Futures in Athens in 2017, and Resilient Futures in Piraeus and Thessaloniki in 2018, and the poetic anthology Futures, Poetry of the Greek Crisis, are just three of countless examples. As many have argued, the major shifts in the Greek social fabric since the crisis generated a crisis of meaning, which also involved a critical rethinking of different periods of Greek history. Dimitris Papanikolaou coined the term archive trouble to capture this iconoclastic return to the past in the years of the crisis. Writers, poets, filmmakers, artists in Greece reinvent the past and its remnants. They delve into archives of the past, but with a constant reference to the present or the future. They place past objects in new constellations and unearth forgotten patterns and voices while trying to give expression to a radically changed, precarious present. Given the fascinating work that has emerged from these conditions, many speak of a cultural renaissance in Greece since the crisis. Especially domains such as poetry, public art, theatre, and cinema are receiving international attention. A recent New York Times article with the title "Athens Rising" presents the city as, quote, emerging from the wreckage as one of Europe's most vibrant cultural capitals. Films by Yorgos Lanthimos, Athina Reitsotsangari, and many other filmmakers, some associated with the so-called Greek weird wave in cinema, have placed Greek cinema in the international spotlight. One of the most important contemporary art events, Documenta, traditionally held in Kassel, Germany, chose Athens as its second city venue in 2017 under the title Learning from Athens. What can we learn then from Greece today? What makes current forms of artistic production in the country relevant for international audiences or paradigmatic for new social and artistic imaginaries in Europe and the Mediterranean? To flesh out these questions and reflections, I will now take you through two works that both struggle to open up the contracted horizon of a present in crisis through a future-oriented engagement with the past. An object of the present, a film, that rethinks the remnants of the past from the experience of the now, and an object of the past, a poem that thinks our present through another context and another crisis. The documentary film Archipelagos Naked Granites, Archipelaga Gymni Granites, by Daphne Heretakis from 2015, registers the experience of a precarious present by inserting in it images of the past in unfamiliar constellations. A voiceover reads the diary of a woman, and we follow her everyday life in crisis-ridden Athens through phases of depression, optimism, boredom, despair, and inertia. The camera moves through Athens, alternating still shots with movement, majestic monuments with dilapidated, graffiti-covered buildings, panoramic views with close-ups, images of normality with shots of disruption. The diary entries are interrupted by interviews with people in the streets, asked to talk about their present and their future expectations. If you woke up one day and found out the Acropolis wasn't there anymore, what would you think? What would that mean for Greece? These questions are posed to a group of teenagers who rush to answer the loss of our civilization, and Greece is just that. Their response highlights the dependency of modern Greeks on the classical past for understanding themselves as national subjects. The next scene shows the Acropolis starting to collapse and turning into rubble and dust. If in Greek national narratives ancient ruins have often functioned as signifiers of the nation's continuity from ancient to modern times, the rubble and dust in Heretakis' apocalyptic image force viewers to ask, in the manner of Constantine Cavafy, «Και τώρα τι θα γίνουμε χωρίς Ακρόπολη?» And now, what's going to happen to us without the Acropolis? The collapsing Acropolis invites viewers to consider the ancient past beyond the dependency of the present on that past, echoing perhaps an earlier poetic reversal of this dependency by celebrated Cypriot poet Kostas Montis. Ό,τι και να είναι η Ακρόπολη δεν υπάρχει χωρίς εμάς. Whatever the Acropolis may be, it doesn't exist without us. In the Greek national imagination, as Yannis Hamilakis argues, antiquities are often described in an anthropomorphic, empathic language as living members of the national body, not just representations of ancestors. Another scene in Heredakis' film tests this relation of ancient statues and contemporary subjects. Faces of young people alternate with images of sculptures drawn from the Antikythera shipwreck, a Roman-era shipwreck from the mid-1st century BC, discovered near the island of Antikythera, south of Peloponnese. The ongoing research of this shipwreck, which is also supported by the Ekaterini Laskaridis Foundation, continues to bring new findings to the surface. The statues in this scene, partly corroded under the influence of algae, oysters, and sea organisms, were exhibited for the first time at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens in 2012, in the midst of the financial crisis. What connects these people with the statues? Do we see resemblances, kinship, or does the scene provoke disconnectedness from the past? The juxtaposition produces no clear analogy between past and present. The film's title comes here into play. Archipelagos, Naked Granites comes from the penultimate verse of a poem by the Greek laureate poet George Seferis, whose poetry forcefully explored the lives of ancient ruins in the present. The previous verse in Seferis' poem is a very famous one. Όπου και να ταξιδέψω, η Ελλάδα με πληγώνει. Wherever I travel, Greece wounds me. In Seferis' poem, this wound pertains to the political traumas of his present in 1936, but also to Greece's complex relation to its past. The idea of the wound was also central to the reception of these statues by the Greek public. When they were first exhibited in the National Archaeological Museum in 2012, some read the statues as allegories for the victims of the country's crisis, as dismembered or sick subjects deprived of their dignity. In this reading, the disfigured statues became material testimonies of past wounds and lost perfection, superimposed on the trauma of the present crisis. But the naked granites in Heredakis' scene do more than that. Their corrosion may resemble a disease of the flesh or deformity, but it also indexes the continued life of these statues as parts of an underwater ecosystem for millennia. This other life, away from the context of their emergence, stresses their vulnerability to time, but also their ability to survive by transforming. The film relates people and statues through this shared vulnerability. As material objects, not just symbolic capital, the statues do not index a lost perfection, but are cast here as imperfect yet active parts of the present. Placed in a shared present continuous, ancient fragments and young people enter a relation with an open outcome, a relation that also resides in the word archipelago of the film's title. For Edouard Glissant, the great writer of the French Caribbean, the geographical formation of an archipelago, a cluster of islands, inspired a way of thinking and being in the world in which a multiplicity of fragments are interconnected in a non-hierarchically ordered totality. The relation of these islands, without origin or center, ambiguous, in constant transformation, provided for Glissant an alternative to what he called continental, exclusionary ways of thinking. In a complex process of cultural translation, Glissant's archipelago re-enters the Aegean archipelago through Seferis' verse in the film's title. Both voices accompany the film's search for new relations between past and present, through which ruins and fragments can become agents in shaping future languages. So how can fragments carry futurity? To ponder this question, I turn now to a poem by Konstantin Kavafi, a diasporic Greek who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, between 1863 and 1933, and a central figure in European modernism and world literature. Cavafy did not publish his poetry during his lifetime, but circulated his poems in small handmade editions to people he respected. In fact, the very first edition of Cavafy's poems was not published in Greece, but in the Netherlands, in 1934, a year after Cavafy's death. 25 poems, translated by Gerard Hendrik Blanken, who later became professor of medieval and modern Greek literature at the University of Amsterdam. Besides Blanken's translations, other Dutch translations of Cavafy continue to be published, and this year only, a revised edition of Cavafy's poems and a new translation appeared, making Cavafy the most beloved modern Greek poet in this country. There are artworks or texts that follow us in our life as constant partners in thinking. For me, Cavafy's poems have been such partners. Cavafy could not be missing from a discussion of the futurity of things past. His whole poetry could in fact be read as a response to this question. What does it take for past objects, people, or worlds to come alive in the present? In the book I am writing on Cavafy's work, I explore what I call his poetics of the spectrum, strategies for conjuring the past and making past objects, including the poems themselves, active forces in future presence. George Seferis likened the effect of Cavafy's poetry to that of a missing statue that has been displaced but is still felt in the present, like a phantom limb. I exchanged Seferis' metaphor of the missing statue with that of a fractured statue. According to literary theory Paul de Man, canonical literary texts have often been made into statues, transformed into historical and aesthetic objects. These statues, de Man argues, sometimes need to be fractured in order to come alive in the present. The fissure in the bust of Cavafy by artist Apostolos Fanakidis, a strip of red neon light that seems to bring life to a cold statue, works as a visual metaphor of this position. In tune with Cavafy's own strategies for conjuring the past through its fragments, fracturing a poem may also be a way of activating its futurity. With this in mind, I turn to the poem «Εν μεγάλη ελληνική απικία 200 π.Χ.» in a large Greek colony, 200 BC, which was published in 1928. The speaker in this poem lives in 200 BC